pilot program. With that, thank you again for the invitation to be here, and I'll be glad to answer your questions once we hear from Saul. Saul?
Thank you, Senators, Representative. Well, I think Mark laid out the Democratic system fairly well, and we've participated in similar systems. The biggest difference is the Republicans, by their national rule, do allow an open primary, where the Democrats do not. And so since 1980, we've really had a different process of how we've operated that. Traditionally, Republicans have used either a convention process or the presidential primary, whatever now what would be called the consolidated date would be in the primary situation. So we've moved at it from two different venues. We've expressed an interest as a party as a whole to hold a joint presidential primary with the Democrats. Mark and I have been working on, with members of our party, some legislation that we hope to ultimately have introduced and potentially passed that would allow us to do a joint primary together. What I think Mark pointed out, the challenge for us is we have to meet both the Democratic national rules, which requires some type of closing that primary, and what that exactly means. And then from our standpoint, I mean, we're probably a little more flexible in that regard, but we also want to make sure it works well and fits with respect to the consolidated elections and what would happen to local units and some of the other things. So we're moving towards that. Our date, we would like to, and again, I go back to the presidential primary, we would prefer to go February 5th or earlier. February 5th is the first date that the window is open for both the Republican and Democratic primaries to hold it without losing any delegates. So if we can work out a joint agreement with the Democrats, we would be proposing to do that on the 5th. And we do have flexibility to move earlier if possible, but I don't think we're as, the Democrats have a little bit of a different challenge internally amongst their national party, so I'm not sure we'd be willing to ruin Christmas for an election, but I think we'll stick to those, keep the family events separate from the electoral events. So we'd probably move somewhat earlier into January and be flexible on January dates, but once they move before that and get closer to the holidays, I think that would be a detriment that our party would not be interested in doing. I think that both Mark and I agree that the presidential process has gotten to be very much out of hand. It's gone a lot earlier than it should be. We're dealing with things that he and I both talked about, ways that might be worthwhile taking a look at in a bipartisan standpoint of reforming the process, but it has to be done nationally. I do think what Senator Levin and others have done with respects to making sure that our states have a greater role and influence. As an example, if we were to go to 29th, a Michigan and Florida primary would be a very powerful primary nationwide. You'd have two very large representative states that I think are very different than Iowa and New Hampshire, and would probably give the American people a much better idea of who our better nominees would be in both parties. And I think that's the goal. I mean, both of us are trying to pick the best nominee for each party to give the American people a choice. So that's one of the things that I think we agree on. So from a Republican standpoint, our first choice is going to be hopefully a joint primary, if that's possible. If not, we will have to come up with a fallback position. But I'm cautiously optimistic that if the Democrats don't get forced into some of the positions that they have publicly taken based on what maybe New Hampshire or somebody else does, that if it stays with Florida, I think we have a very good possibility. And someone asked me earlier, I said I thought maybe this might be as high as 80% probability that we could do a joint primary, but again, there's just a lot of unknown things out there. Let me just very quickly address some of the reforms that Mark brought up, and you know, we've had some experiences, I think, around the city of Detroit with complaints around the state of Michigan, and particularly, obviously, in the city of Detroit last time around, where some issues were raised that caused some concern. Same-day registration in Wisconsin. Folks that participated from our side were talking about people walking in with utility bills. They don't require any type of ID. It was there was a lot of concern about just fraud and people walking in and voting wherever they wanted to, and sometimes voting more than once. That is a big concern on same-day registration. I think that this is a very important constitutional right for all citizens of this country to vote, but only vote once, because if they do vote more than once, or if they're not a citizen, with the number of illegal immigrants we currently have and the ability for them to get IDs, if they were able to vote, I think it takes away from yours and mine and every legal citizen's right to exercise their constitutional duty. So I would be very concerned about that, not from a standpoint of making it easy to vote. I think our system is pretty easy as is. I think the problem is more that fraud and deceit is a much greater danger to democracy in general. our votes are only as good as they are cast, and if someone else is coming in there and voting it and abusing it, then all of those of us who are legal citizens who came here are exercising our votes, our rights are taken away, and so that's what I'm concerned about. Same address. Well, college kids are pretty smart. They ought to make a choice, like we all do. Register where you want to vote. Make sure it is viable and legal address. And again, we had experiences in several college campuses where MoveOn.org and some other organizations were literally, trying to get people out of dorms to show up and vote, and it caused problems that I think are not in the best interest of democracy as a whole. Photo ID is the law of the land in Michigan. I think it's a good idea. I don't see any reason why anybody would object to somebody showing up and saying, I am who I say I am, showing an ID and voting. It just makes common sense. We had examples, I believe it was 68 folks who voted last time who had death certificates who were filed before the election. George W. Bush registered to vote in a warehouse in Flint and voted in an election this last time. There are people who are willing to play games and abuse the system. And I think, again, it's just as important for us to protect the rights of those who legally vote and legally participate as those who want to come in and make it so easy that they have to have no responsibility. I think the idea of taking a little bit of responsibility to exercise what arguably is one of the most fundamental and important rights in our country is not asking too much at all. No reason AV. Again, this is one of those mixed bags. We take a look at how we can help facilitate voting, but at the same time, we've come up with a rationale that if you care enough, you ought to come out and vote, and you ought to show up on Tuesday in Michigan and cast your vote, because it matters. And it's a way to ensure that people are exercising a vote and want to exercise a vote, and not just, who can put together a better turnout model where they're going out and getting people who don't care, and you set up the potential for abuse. As I think all of you are aware, there are still roomfuls of absentee votes that the FBI has seized from the last election that are still sitting, that were signed, unopened, unfilled out, others in various forms. You just increase the chances for fraud. And I think it's a two-way street. You can argue, is it more important to increase everybody's participation, or is it more important for those who actually care and do it legally to vote? I would take the position that I would be more cautious, and I don't want to lose my right as a citizen who cares and comes out to do it for someone who's willing to abuse it. Internet voting, I think, would be very interesting. Plays into a lot of these issues. Again, my biggest concern would be fraud. My biggest concern would be ways that others could organize and buy and sell IDs and abilities to go in there and vote. Every election day I show up, there's a pretty good line at my township with a willingness for people to show up and vote. Those who can't, AVs, there's a bigger participation of people who do vote AV. We're doing our best to make sure it's as legal and as careful and as safe as possible, but again, anytime you open it up for potential fraud, that would be my concern. We've seen it over and over again, and so I would just encourage you to be very cautious, very careful on that, and do everything you possibly could to make sure that those who truly are registered to vote have their right to vote, and not stolen by someone else who shouldn't be voting. It's the same thing, and negate your vote or my vote. Thank you very much. We want to ask the question.
If you can comment on you both seem very willing to work together on trying to make sure that we all have a say in who the nominees are on both sides of the ticket. So what needs to happen for you to get to some sort of compromise?
Mark's got a tougher position than we do, so let me go first, and then he can respond with respect to what the concerns the Democratic Party has. Look, I think it would be a great opportunity for us if we could have a state-run joint primary where the Democrats and Republicans agreed to participate in a system that both of us were comfortable with and we could do together. Now, Mark and I have been working on legislation to potentially do that over the last year, and I think conceptually we agree. We've spent a lot of time with the Secretary of State's office as well, working through details. There were a lot of things that were raised by the Secretary of State's office, by township and local municipalities. We addressed most of those things and are now, I believe, on third or fourth draft, at least to give us something to talk about from a bill standpoint. So if we could work it out, and part of it then depends on our local politics. And this, I'll let Mark address what the Democrat concerns are, and they really have more of the concerns than we do. From my standpoint and from the Republican standpoint, our state committee has voted to support presidential primary to move forward. We've accepted the general tenets of the bill, the things that we had a presidential task force that met for almost a year a year ago.